a National Center for Advocacy, Information, and Collaboration. Our purpose is to eliminate fees in the criminal legal system and ensure that any fines that are imposed equitably and collected equitably. And just before I go too far into that, I should explain what I'm talking about when I talk about fines and fees. I think everyone is familiar with fines. We know them from speeding tickets and parking tickets, but they are monetary sanctions that are imposed as punishment for any time anyone violates the law. They can be imposed in the criminal or civil sense. We think about them in our common experience as traffic and parking, but they can also be imposed for misdemeanors and felonies in this country. When we talk about fees, we're talking about something else. Fees are essentially taxes that attach to any time that someone has any touch with the criminal legal system. And they can take many different forms depending on where you live. They look different, the amounts are different, and where that money goes is different. Depending on where you live, you can be assessed fees or costs or surcharges for booking, for your prosecution, for your public defender, the free lawyer that you're supposed to get if you can't afford attorney. In 44 states, you can be charged for your public defender. In some places, you're charged room and board for every day that you're incarcerated. And so those costs, which are essentially taxes, can add up sometimes more than the fine itself and come with a whole host of consequences that are similar to fines. For people who can afford to pay their fines and fees, they pay and they walk away and they probably don't think about them a whole lot after that. But for people who can't afford to pay, there's really a different system of justice. If you can't afford to pay, you can face additional fines and fees. There can be late fees and penalties and interest, even charges for paying fines and fees over time. You can have prolonged justice involvement. In many states, you cannot leave parole or probation until you finish paying off all of your fines and fees. Or you may be forced to come into court over and over to explain why you haven't paid. There can be civil judgments entered against you, which can affect your ability to get education, get housing. You can be disenfranchised. I think a lot of people heard a lot about this in the instance of Florida with Amendment 4, felony disenfranchisement, and the legislature passed a law that says you can't get your right to vote back until you pay off your fines and fees. But in fact, that's the case in 30 states in this country. If you have a felony conviction and you haven't paid off your fines and fees, you cannot vote. You can also have your driver's license suspended. When we started the Fines and Fees Justice Center a few years ago, it was true in 44 states. Now it's true in 36 states. If you cannot afford to pay your fines and fees, your driver's license will be suspended. And you can even face incarceration. And in addition to the harms that this is doing on the individual level, this is to the people who actually get fines and fees, there's also really big institutional and government consequences to running a system this way. And fines and fees have a significant impact on public safety. Alabama Appleseed did a survey of 1,000 people who owed fines and fees or family members who were paying off fines and fees. And in that survey, 38% of respondents admitted that they committed a crime in order to pay off their fines and fees, generally selling drugs or selling their own bodies. This can actually be a driver of increased crime rather than a way of holding people accountable. When we talk about debt-based driver's license suspensions, when your license is suspended because you can't afford to pay your fines and fees, that can make it impossible to get car insurance, which of course makes everyone on the road less safe. And there's a really fascinating study that was done that looked at 9,000 cities across the United States and their level of reliance on fines and fees for revenue. And what they found is that for the average small city of 28,000 people or less, that's actually the average size city in the United States. In the average city, you are earning about 1 to 2% of your revenue through fines and fees. For every increase of 1% in reliance on fines and fees, that was associated with a 6.1% decrease in resolving violent crimes. And of course, this makes sense. We have, especially in small cities, a very limited amount of criminal justice resources and a limited amount of law enforcement. And if we are using them as tax collectors rather than enforcing public safety, those are the kinds of consequences we can see or expect to see. And I think we're very excited about presenting at this conference in particular because fines and fees is a very intersectional issue. We think of it often in the criminal justice space because it is something that ties people to the criminal legal system, but it is also an issue of racial equity because of over-policing in communities of color. Black and brown people are disproportionately stopped, they're disproportionately charged, they are disproportionately punished. And so fines and fees fall very disproportionately on communities of color. And when we look at the collateral consequences and the demographics of poverty, the collateral consequences are magnified in communities of color. And this is an economic justice issue, very much because the way that we are using fines and fees is extracting wealth from poor communities. It is essentially a regressive tax structure that is taking money, huge amounts of money from the poorest communities. At the Fines and Fees Justice Center, we have a three-pronged approach to how we address fines and fees. So I said we are a center for information. So the first thing we wanted to do was figure out how do we share information about what fines and fees reform looks like around the country. So we built an online clearinghouse. It's on our website. Any of you can find it. And we've pulled together all of the research, legislation, litigation, pilot projects, anything about fines and fees reform that you can find around the country, and put it in a navigable form so that if you are an advocacy organization or a policymaker or the media or a grassroots group and you want to figure out what does fines and fees reform look like, what are the kinds of approaches I can take to fines and fees reform in my community, there's a resource with information about what's been tried and what's been successful around the country. And the bulk of what we do, we are primarily an advocacy organization. And so our first priority was to develop a replicable advocacy model for state-based reform. We are currently working in 4 different states, and I'll go into that in a few minutes. But the idea is, when I say a replicable model, is the idea is to build multiple campaigns that we run simultaneously to build more and more momentum on fines and fees reform, first addressing the issues that are the biggest problem in the local community, but to build enough momentum to get to the bigger conversation, which is how do we fairly fund the justice system and how do we fairly fund government? And our ultimate goal of getting towards elimination of all fees in the system and making fines proportionate. And then the other thing that we do is we're the only national organization that works exclusively on fines and fees reform, and we provide fines and fees reform support nationwide. That takes a few different models. We take daily calls from advocates and policymakers around the country who are interested in working on fines and fees reform in their own communities, and we will advise them, we'll help them find partners, we'll help them draw media attention, we'll review legislation, we'll provide whatever help is needed. But the other thing we do is we take what we've learned on our state and local work to figure out what are the kinds of problems that are affecting states and communities around the country, and we build national campaigns to address those issues. So for example, you'll hear me talk quite a lot about the issue of driver's license suspensions for unpaid fines and fees. This is an area where we work very heavily in our states where we have staff on the ground, but also supporting campaigns around the country. And we've built a national campaign, which has over 150 organizations that are members, and to build tools that help support local reforms and also to support national reform to incentivize states to do the right thing. We also have a project working with cities and counties around the country. It's called Cities and Counties for Fine and Fee Justice. We are partnered with the San Francisco Financial Justice Project and a group called Policy Link, and working with 10 cities and counties around the country, including Shelby County. And Wesley has been a really important part of the team working in Shelby County on fines and fees reform. So in our states where we work, we have staff on the ground in 4 states right now: New York, Florida, Nevada, and New Mexico. And the idea is that I am in New York City, and my My co-director is in Washington, D.C., and we are not intending to tell anyone anywhere else what they should do locally in terms of what reform should look like. We have staff on the ground, and they build broad coalitions to address the problems that are of biggest concerns in those communities. And so the partnerships may look different in each state, but what's really critical is to partner with grassroots groups and especially directly harmed people to make sure that we are responsive to the community, and we are working with community to get solutions that are actually going to work for people who are directly harmed. So in New York, we have a few different campaigns. We actually just succeeded in ending debt-based driver's license suspensions in New York at the end of the last session, which is the end of the last year. We're now working on a bill to end predatory fees in the criminal legal system, and we're also working on a bill to end jail and prison phone calls. This is a campaign that we started at a local level with partners in New York City, and then helped other cities and counties around the country to also try to replicate that strategy along with our partners. And in fact, San Francisco and as of yesterday, San Diego have ended the cost of jail phone calls in those counties. And we're hoping to be able to move this as a statewide issue. In Florida, we're also working on the driver's license suspension. 1 in 8 drivers right now in Florida has their license suspended because they can't afford to pay fines and fees. We're also working on the issue of juvenile fines and fees. All those kinds of fees and fines that we talked about in the adult system, in many states, they exist in the juvenile justice system as well. And when kids and their families can't afford to pay them, they can end up with all sorts of consequences, including never being able to leave the justice system or denied access to diversion programs. In Nevada, we're also working on the driver's license suspension issue. We're also working on decriminalizing traffic tickets. In Nevada, Nevada is one of 13 states where a traffic ticket is a criminal violation, which means that every time you don't respond or pay for a traffic ticket, you can have a warrant for your arrest. And we want to move it out of the criminal system to end that. In New Mexico, we're also working on the driver's license suspension issue, the juvenile fines and fees issue, and also a bill on changing how we measure ability to pay and considering someone's economic circumstance at the point where fines and fees are imposed. And I went a little bit into what our national campaigns look like already, but these are sort of some of the areas of national work that we work on. And I think we've covered all of these, so I'm going to keep on going. And I think one of the really exciting things about fines and fees reform is that there's tremendous opportunity to move fines and fees reform in, not even only small incremental ways, but really significant systemic ways, because this issue has bipartisan support. And groups that we may never think about partnering with are potentially partners here. And we may, when we find ultimate solutions, we may diverge paths in some places, but we've had great partnerships on the left and the right. And in fact, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, has great policy on driver's license suspensions and agrees with us that driver's licenses should never be suspended other than for dangerous driving, but never for failure to pay or for missing a hearing date. And because we work with different partners, the political environments that we work in New York versus Florida are very, very different. So the way that we frame the issue and the way we develop our strategy and our messaging will look really different depending on our partnerships and depending on the political environment. And just to give you a sense, here's a video that we created around driver's license suspensions in New York. And I'm going to move out of here and switch over to another screen so I can just show you a video or a clip from a video. Here we go. And hopefully you'll be able to hear this.
We were driving, it was like 6, 7 o'clock in the morning. My sugar got really low. I started shaking. He sped out, he came up behind us, pulled over. I told him what happened. I was arrested, and Now I have to pay $3,000 in fines for Virginia. $3,000, that's a lot of money. Because I couldn't afford to pay my fines, my license was suspended and I ended up in jail in 2 different states. My first phone call from jail was to my mom. It was heartbreaking. Like, she answered and like, what's wrong? Where you at? What is going on? And I'm like, I'm in jail, about to die. Like, I'm gonna die here. They're not giving me medicine. It was like the worst experience. After like 2 days, I finally was able to call her. And yeah, it was hard. Very hard.
I got a call from Desiree's mother that Desiree was in jail. I called Desiree.
Okay, so that is how we told the story in New York. This is a story of a woman who needed insulin and couldn't get it and almost died while she was incarcerated for driving on a suspended license that had been suspended because she hadn't paid a fine or a fee. And we always try to center the voices of impacted people in our campaigns. And in New York, it was really important to tell the story of the public health disaster that we're creating and the harms to individuals was very persuasive to legislators. Our campaigns in Florida look a little bit different. In Florida, we are working on a driver's license bill, and we posted this billboard that every single legislator sees as they drive to the state capitol. And it includes a quote from Grover Norquist, the president of Americans for Tax Reform, who is pointing out why driver's license suspensions are a terrible idea. And the focus of the campaign there is really on the economy, and that this doesn't make sense for Florida taxpayers to be footing a bill to keep trying to collect court debt that's not going to happen and suspend people's license, which creates all sorts of economic problems in Florida. And we also created a video in Florida, which I also would like to show you. And so I'm sorry, I'm toggling between several screens. Oops. Hold on. So here is our Florida video, and I'm just going to show a clip from this because of time.
I'd like you to meet my friend Anthony.
Hi.
Anthony's a great worker and he loves his job. But he has a court fine and he's been trying to put together enough money to pay it off. It's not easy. You do want to pay the fine, right?
Of course I do.
It's been hard. Anthony's the sole provider for his family. He works long hours. Between food, rent, and bills, there isn't any extra money. Last month, Anthony didn't have enough to make his payment, so Florida suspended his driver's license.
How am I supposed to drive to work?
Here's the problem. In Florida, if you're late paying your fines and fees, your driver's license is suspended. I know what you're thinking. That makes no sense. If you lose your license, how can you get to work? If you can't get to work, how can you make money to pay the fine?
Exactly.
So this is a little bit about the strategy and how it looks different in the different places where we work. And this is obviously, in the interest of time, I could spend 2 days doing this with you all, but this is sort of just one example of how we might tell the same story in different ways in different places that we work. So with that being said, I'm going to turn this over to Wesley and to talk about what's happening in one jurisdiction where you're working on multiple fines and fees issues.
Yeah, can everyone hear me? So great, like as Joanna said, I am working in Memphis, Shelby County, Tennessee, on the issues of fines and fees. I've been doing this work here in Shelby County for a little bit over a year and a half now. Just like in most of the rest of the country, this century has brought an increase in the use of fines and fees that are assessed on people who have made contact with the criminal legal system. between 2005 and 2017, the state of Tennessee, or the state's legislature, passed 46 bills that increased the amount of debt owed by individuals who made contact with the system. The increase in cost assessed is largely motivated by the kind of unending growth of the criminal legal system over the past few decades. And therefore, the legislature or legislators across the country justify the use of these fines and fees or the passage of such bills as a way to fund the system that is growing so endlessly. As Joanna mentioned, there are a ton of costs or there are a ton of consequences that these costs lead to. Some of the ones that I encounter most frequently are ineligibility for expungement, as well as various types of encumbered driver's licenses, meaning suspension, restricted, all those things, as well as ineligibility to restore one's voting rights. Importantly, another very serious consequence of these fines and fees is continued contact with the criminal legal system. And that's important because typically, right, we would want the system ideally, assuming we want us to do anything, which is kind of a big assumption to make, but we would want the system to be, rehabilitating people so that they don't have to go through the system again. However, it's literally through fines and fees creating a system in which people cannot be released from it because they're always indebted to it, literally. While more attention is being brought to the issue throughout the country, and I applaud this conference for having a session like this, I really appreciate the space being given to this issue in recent years. By and large, the Tennessee legislature, however, has not budged on the issue of fines and fees. And as I mentioned, just a few years ago, passed more legislation to create more debt for individuals. So advocates here locally and across the state have had to figure out strategies to reduce the amount of debt that many of our clients owe, and create strategies to eventually eliminate the fines and fees structure that exists currently. So I'm going to just detail 4 kind of avenues or strategies that we're using, and then I'll be done. So the first is partnering with communities. And so with our work with the Fines and Fees Justice Center or the Cities and Counties for Fines and Fees Project, I'm in a coalition of that consists of the commissioner, the Shelby County Commissioner, the Mayor's Office, other advocates on the issue besides me, and people who work actually in the clerk's office. And we're in coalition in order to strategize ways that we can feasibly move forward on this issue and create change for people that that we advocate for, that we represent, right? And most of these people are obviously poor people. One of the ways that we do this is also through connecting with business partners. Some businesses in our community have taken an interest in this issue. And some of them have even been willing to put up money in order to wipe out individuals' fines and fees, as well as providing pro bono resources to advocate for the elimination of fines and fees before judges. So I'll talk about that first way first, and then I'll talk about the second in a second. The issue of creating a fund to pay fines and fees is kind of a controversial one, in that we are essentially kind of buying into the state's rationale here by saying, okay, you know what, we'll just pay the fees for people. And so we don't want to ever create a situation where our advocacy is just further entrenching the system. What we do want to do with that tactic, though, is by creating these funds and having kind of outside third-party investors, right, creating these type of funds, it does create stakeholders, right? So it creates more people who have an interest or an investment in the issue, in the topic, right? And so what we intend to do with our advocacy in that realm is then to create these stakeholders who will then be useful in our legislative advocacy efforts, right? So we can go to the Tennessee State Legislature and say, hey, look, this corporation even finds this an egregious policy and we want this change, and has in fact invested money into this issue, so much, which is a significant kind of indicator of their desire to see it changed. As I mentioned, also we have individual representation. So we recruit pro bono attorneys. I also engage in some of this representation to get individuals' court costs, their court debt waived. Tennessee state law allows for the liberal waiving of almost all court debt. There's very few categories of debt that cannot be waived. And so we want to capitalize on this by encouraging judges to waive the debt. So that comes in the form of individual advocacy for individual clients that we represent, but it also comes in the form of lobbying these judges to change their court rules, their individual courtroom rules in their individual courtrooms, to make it so that less people have to pay court debt, and the debt such as fees, these kind of very unnecessary, regressive types of debt, are completely eliminated in these courtrooms. Our last two kind of strategies that we use, one is local advocacy through local ordinance changes. So a number of court debts in our system are created by the Tennessee State Legislature, but have to be authorized by our local commissions, our local county commissions. And so, although we have a state legislature that seems very unlikely to make any changes in this realm, we do have a county commission that seems very willing to make changes here. As I mentioned before, we're working with a commissioner and the mayor as a part of our coalition. And so, for the court debts that are kind of authorized by the commission, we are trying to target those and get the commission to reduce or completely eliminate those debts. And then our final advocacy strategy is elimination of jail phone calls, which is something that Joanna mentioned, I said a few times in some of their advocacy. And so just generally, we believe that people who are in jail should not be charged these kind of egregious fees in order to make phone calls to their loved ones. There's been a lot of work around this across the state. Joanna actually informed me that New York was, I think, the first, right, to make some major changes in this area. And so we're trying to take up the mantle now and make some changes here locally. And I'll stop there. That's kind of the advocacy strategies that we have depended on, and we are still working through as we try to eliminate or completely reduce or completely eliminate fines and fees here locally.
Thank you so much, Wesley. And we're going to open this up for questions, but I just want to I'm really excited to partner with Wesley because I think between us, we can sort of talk about the strategy of advocating from outside of government, working within government, working in left-wing places, working in right-wing places, direct representation versus systemic changes, all the different strategies that you can have to sort of a lot of different angles that you can take to make fines and fees reform in your community. So I obviously welcome your questions, but one of the first things I would love to hear from you all is, have you come across fines and fees in your own communities, and what are some of the problems that you're seeing in your own communities?
Hi, I'm David Potoff. This is only tangentially related, but it shows the nature of the problem because it's not a suspension because I didn't pay a fee. I'll admit to it. I was speeding in Virginia in 2017 and got a ticket, a very expensive fine, but fine, and recognize I'm an old white guy who's a retired federal employee. So it's not an issue of the money, but it's the kind of thing you should be worried about. 3.5 years later, which means this past November, I got a statement of a proposed suspension of my license from the state of Massachusetts where I live. Again, 3.5 years later, after it happened, with a $500 fine in the middle of the COVID. My pension keeps going. with no way to really appeal because everything is closed down, and my license would have been suspended unless I paid $500. I could do that and afford it. I cannot imagine what it would mean to someone who loses their job in the middle of COVID and out of the blue gets a fine and with a threat of suspension or license. So again, it was not the kind of thing where I hadn't paid a fine, but the suspension of license is absolutely ridiculous at any time, but certainly in the middle of a COVID.
Yeah, and actually one of the things that we've been doing is tracking how it's handled during COVID. We put out recommendations about the management of fines and fees during COVID. We also did a polling of Americans, and more than 80% of Americans agreed that there should be a moratorium on fines and fees during COVID. And one of the things that we've recommended is we should stop all license suspensions during COVID. We think they should end, obviously, long run, but during COVID, it raises particular problems. And we've heard all over the country about people who can't get it resolved once their license is suspended, with courts operating not at all or in very partial capacities. It's almost impossible to resolve it, even if you had the money to resolve it. And of course, for now, millions more people have slipped into poverty during COVID. The ability to pay a $500 fine is simply unimaginable to a very significant swath of this population, but especially obviously among low-income communities and communities of color. And so I'm glad you raised this. And I will say that Virginia has ended the suspensions of fines and fees just in the last legislative session for non-payment of fines and fees. They also did something else. There's a compact between states that there's more than 40 signatories to it, that basically each state agrees that they will recognize the suspensions that other states impose. So that if you were suspended in Virginia, but you moved to Massachusetts, that Massachusetts would recognize the suspension in Virginia, and you wouldn't be able to get your license in Massachusetts either. When Virginia passed their bill, they withdrew from this compact. And this is a compact that, I think it was, I don't think you need to withdraw from it, but it means that they don't have to send any record of suspensions to anywhere else, and they don't have to recognize suspensions that are happening for unpaid fines and fees by other states as well.
If I just may add, yeah, it is very complicated, this reciprocity, because this is how my ticket from Virginia got to Massachusetts, but through a bureaucratic foul up, it took 3.5 years to record it. But you're absolutely right. The motor vehicles system is not working. My license was going to expire, and it took forever. That had nothing to do with this case and my wife. It took forever, and with finally going through AAA to get your license renewed, because if you're over 65 or over 70, you can't do it online because you need an eye test. And the motor vehicle system is totally, inundated with this. And the idea that they were going through with suspensions is absolutely absurd.
It is, and in fact, it's also it's a problem that causes a host of other problems. In the states that suspend licenses still for unpaid fines and fees, you will find that driving on a suspended license is one of the most common criminal charges that you will find in every court across the country. We estimated in New York, like a really back of the envelope estimate, we suspect it's about 10% of the entire criminal docket. In New York City, where fewer people drive, it's the number 4 most common criminal charge. In Rochester, Buffalo, and Long Island, it is the number 1 most common criminal charge. And so then, because you have no choice but to continue to drive, to access work, to access your basic necessities, to get groceries, to get your kids to school, to access healthcare, people will continue to drive. And the next time you're pulled over, you're then charged with driving on a suspended license, which is a misdemeanor everywhere. It comes with more fines and fees that entrench you further into the system, and possible jail time. And so that's how we take an issue that is really just about poverty, and we induct people on the basis of their poverty into the criminal legal system. Or is anyone else encountering fines and fees issues in their own communities?
I can just share a little story. My family lives in Alabama, and so this was a few years back. But I know there were certain counties that would suspend your license without notice for unpaid traffic violations, like speeding tickets and stuff. And I was following it a few years ago. I know there was a lawsuit. I don't know what the outcome of that is, or if it's still in court. But in my parents live in a small town of maybe 7,000, and it's an hour and a half south of Montgomery. That's the biggest city in that sort of range. So it's a small town, but it's like considered the big city of the, or big town of the area. And my dad had a suspended license for a different charge that happened, and he lived close to work, so he could walk to work. But it made driving to like any sort of any event, like grocery store, anything, like just so dangerous, because there's so much police activity there. So they're always trying to monitor people. The chance of getting caught, just getting pulled over for no real reason, was really high. And it was kind of over over unpaid fines, and it was over some tickets that he had incurred. And just kind of forgot he's just really bad organized. And then it just snowballed into this whole episode, which made things really, really complicated, dangerous for something so simple. So that's kind of what he went through. I'm not really sure how Alabama, what the situation is now there, but that's my interaction with fines and fees.
They are still suspending in Alabama, but there's a bill before the legislature right now in Alabama. Alabama has taken a big lead in pushing that issue. Montgomery, though, has also seen quite a bit of litigation around their fines and fees practices. The ACLU brought a number of cases, and they reached some settlements that have changed how courts operate in Montgomery for the better, but there is plenty of work to be done. The license suspension issue, everywhere it exists, tends to be the issue that comes up all the time because it's impacting so many people. We did some survey work around the country, and we couldn't get data from every state, but even so, we found 11 million suspensions, and that represented, I think, 28 states, just data from 28 states. We found 11 million suspensions around the country. This is something that is keeping huge numbers of poor people trapped in the criminal legal system, but we believe is solvable. We actually have a federal bill right now that's sponsored by Senator Coons from Delaware, and has bipartisan support. In fact, Senator Grassley, Joni Ernst, several Republican senators, everyone who has sponsored this bill, they sponsor it in pairs. So the Driving for Opportunity Act is a federal act that will incentivize states to end debt-based driver's license suspensions, and will provide funds to states to actually cover any losses that are caused by reinstatement fees to states that end driver's license suspensions. And it would come with, I think, $100 million of funding over 5 years to incentivize states to end the practice. And it has a number of bipartisan sponsors, in part because the way that they have structured sponsorship of the bill is that any Democrat who wants to co-sponsor has to find a Republican to join them. Any Republican who wants to co-sponsor the bill has to find a Democrat to join them. So we have a number of co-sponsors for the bill that are across both parties. And the primary sponsors are Senator Coons from Delaware and also Senator Wicker from Mississippi. Again, it's partnerships that you don't often talk about together. And the places that this issue has moved are places that you never talk about together. The first two states to move on this issue were California and Mississippi, which, I don't know of that many contexts where you talk about California, Mississippi, Virginia, Washington, and Montana in the same conversation. It just doesn't happen often. And I think that is one of the reasons that we think there's tremendous amounts of promise to move these issues.
I guess I have a sort of a follow-up question. I know these fines and fees, like I'm sure they're not as productive in terms of generating revenue. Having done some preliminary reading at my old workplace, I just remember it being a very high cost for policing and enforcing these fines and fees. But I'm wondering what you would like, how you'd respond to someone's asking how else are states supposed to raise this revenue? Like, where does this money come from? If this is gone, even if you're spending 50 cents on the dollar on enforcing, it's still, providing revenue. So how do you respond to that? Like, what are some alternatives that you can provide?
Sure. And I'll jump in first, but Wesley, if you want to add anything, jump in. So there have been a number of studies about the cost of collections and whether or not this makes sense at all. And in the case of fees, it seems pretty clear that we often spend as much or more to collect fees than we actually bring in, which again makes sense. When we're talking about the criminal legal system, we know that something like 88% of people who are going through the criminal legal system are indigent. So we're de facto trying to collect money from people who don't have any, which is incredibly expensive. And so we have to do things like threaten them with jail or a license suspension to try to extract money from them. That is a very expensive prospect. And the Brennan Center looked at fines and fees. They did a fiscal analysis of fines and fees, imposition and collection across 10 counties in Florida, New Mexico, and Texas. And they found that it was incredibly inefficient. It costs about 99 times as much to collect $1 of fines and fees revenue as it does for the IRS to collect $1 of tax revenue. And in some jurisdictions, notably in their study, Bernalillo County was spending $1.17 to collect $1 of revenue. And so when you think about the collateral consequences, and that study did not actually assess all of the costs, the collateral costs that come with fines and fees. So if you think about, you don't pay your fines and fees, your driver's license is suspended. Now we have police and courts and public defenders spending all this time with 10% of the caseload is just driving out of suspended license cases. And then, some of those people are going to jail, and we're housing them at incredibly high costs to try to get them to pay. And what they're doing, one of the reasons it was so expensive in New Mexico, and we see this in Texas also, is in some places, if you can't afford to pay fines and fees, you do something called sitting it out, where you choose, and I'm going to say, I put choose in quotes, you choose to go to jail. And for every day that you sit in jail, they will forgive some small amount of your fines and fees. In New Mexico right now, the rule is they will forgive, I think it's $56 of your fines and fees that you owe for every day for every 24 hours that you sit in jail. It's basically 8 hours of federal minimum wage. So not only are we not collecting this money, not only are we causing unbelievable harms to people who are sitting in jail and are can lose their jobs, can lose their homes, can lose their children, but we're using that as a way of forgiving and offsetting debt. So we're also, taxpayers are then paying to put people in jail. Obviously, this makes no sense for anyone. There was another study that was done by the Berkeley Policy Advocacy Clinic, which was looking at the use of juvenile fees around California. And they found that in every county that was using it, on average, they were spending 70 cents to collect $1. And in many of the counties, it went over. And they were collecting only tiny amounts of money. And of those tiny amounts of money, 70% was used towards collections. So this is an incredibly inefficient form of generating revenue, and very little revenue is coming in, with enormous harms that are far outweighing any gains.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, by and large, right, a lot of people are just not paying their fines, right? So this kind of idea that the government would be losing money, in a sense, it's like a little bit needs kind of some parsing out, because it's not the case that people are actually paying the amount. And so, as Joanna just said, right, it's a very unreliable source. In the case that people do pay, in some larger kind of populations across the state of Tennessee, for instance, in Shelby County, right, even these very kind of smaller returns they get, are run into the millions, right? And so then you're left with the question, well, even if it's unreliable, we're still getting like, $1 million from this. And then you kind of go to the other kind of costs around the cost and harm to the community, because, these people who are, paying these amounts are mostly, indigent, right? And cannot afford to be paying an extra bill. In addition, we have these, situations. So when I first got to Memphis, the city of Memphis was running a program in which they were paying, I think, up to $2,500 in court debt for anyone who kind of qualified under their specific qualifications. So then we have a situation where the state is creating this dynamic where people have to pay the state. They can't pay, and so they have a city in Memphis, if anyone doesn't know, is a very poor city. The city is then financing, right, this amount that its citizenry cannot pay. And so you have one government entity that is, extracting money from the people, and then another government entity that is already underfunded supplying that money. And that's an incredibly inefficient system, one that I think I think across the board, no one would say is one that's working or functioning properly. And so even when, even in the cases where people are paying, they're not paying often or a lot. And then we also have these kind of perverse consequences where people end up, or where other entities end up funding the state's kind of ill thought policies.
I think one of the complications is that the government entity that is earning money versus the government entity that is incurring the costs of collections are different entities. And so the status quo becomes hard to change because somebody is profiting off of this, even if the whole system doesn't make money. And so, our position is obviously that everything should come out of general revenue. People, the criminal, the justice system is we know there's a three-legged stool of government, and the judiciary and the criminal legal system that falls under it this is a critical part of government, and we should all be paying to fund basic government functions, and this is one of them. But in some places it's really a challenge because the fines and fees are going to all to support all sorts of areas within government. And one of the areas, this issue came up in Texas. So Texas had a driver's license suspension program that everyone hated. Everyone agreed that it was a total disaster. 1 million Texans had their license suspended through something called the Driver Responsibility Program, which was basically if you didn't pay your fines and fees, you continued to pay over 3 years, and every time you didn't, your license was suspended. But the problem is the money that was coming in, although it was not that much, was supporting trauma centers in Texas. And so, everyone wanted to dismantle the program, but how are you going to get those few $1 million that were going towards trauma centers? And Texas is one of those states that doesn't have a state income tax. So it really becomes complicated in how are you going to replace the revenue? And so they came up with a creative solution that said, okay, your car insurance, there's going to be a 2 cent surcharge on all car insurance policies that are supposed to be paid by the insurance companies, but probably it'll get passed to individual users. So there will be a 2 cent increase in everyone's car insurance to cover this. And so, that's still a regressive tax scheme, but it's one where everyone's paying 2 cents versus hundreds of dollars keeping people in perpetual cycles of poverty and justice involvement. So we think that in any political environment and even in different economic schemes that exist in different places to entrench these problems, there are solutions that are far more equitable. And so, we're always looking for sort of the most equitable way of taxing and funding things. And so we will make compromises to go towards a far less regressive tax scheme than the one of fines and fees, which is really one of the most regressive that I can think about in any circumstances. Is anyone else seeing this in their own communities, or coming across this or seeing this as in intersection with the areas where they're working?
I'm sorry, I wasn't able to be here for the beginning part of your session, so I feel like I just dropped in. But it was a really interesting workshop to me, based on, just like the way that people are kept back from advancing themselves. And I think it is so harmful. It's really interesting work that you do. And thank you so much for doing it and bringing attention to these issues.
Yeah, again, I don't want to keep going back to my own personal thing, but just in terms of looking at it, my understanding is what happened in Massachusetts was that it was a big national case. Some truck driver who had a suspended license and his trucking company, it turned out, were all in violations of laws. This truck driver killed 7 motorcyclists in New Hampshire about 18 months ago. Massachusetts then went back and looked at why people with dangerous driving records hadn't had their license suspended. I believe they hired some accounting firm who decided that aside from their bad record keeping, as I've said, it took 3.5 years after my ticket to get something. I think they also decided that the state was losing a lot of money. And so they began to enforcing it a lot. So I think your notion that this is not a money raiser for some unit of government may not be true, but the accounting firm had said, by not enforcing this law, you're losing money and you ought to impose fines from, I think, between 212 fines, fees that you need to reinstate your life. They reinstatement fees is what they're called. So I think Massachusetts decided somehow that they were going to raise money from this, but you might want to just check that out.
They have, Massachusetts does have a problem with license suspensions and trying to use this as
Tell me.
aggressive means of collecting fines and fees. And I think though that it's, one of the reasons that we're in the crisis that we're in with fines and fees today stems from the last big economic recession. What happened in 2008 was, state and local government lost a lot of funds. And so they all tried to use fines and fees to plug those budget holes. And states were giving less money after 2008 to counties and cities. And even after the economic recovery, they continued to defund counties and city governments. So leaving local government sort of with this struggle of how to plug budget holes. And this became an answer. And actually between, I think, since 2008, 48 or 49 states raised their fines and fees. And the problem is, again, it's with this idea. I mean, the same people who put this idea that if we suspend people's licenses, it will compel them to pay. We're using this as a collection tool. But it has the idea that people have the money. And it misses the fact that actually a lot of people don't have the money. I did a conference last year with someone from North Carolina who was he was a DA who had worked on putting in place the law to add license suspensions to try to compel payment of fines and fees. And now he is on the other side trying to undo the harm, because this idea was we're going to compel everyone to pay. But of course, getting your license suspended doesn't magically put money in your pockets. And when we think about where we are now, and the economic disparities have only continued to grow since 2008, people are worse off than ever. And when we think about who is likely to get their license suspended, we are talking about a population that simply, there is no more money. There is no more money to extract. In New York City, where more than 70% of drivers are white, more than 80% of people who are charged with driving on a suspended are not white. Because we are magnifying all these consequences and concentrating them in poor communities and communities of color, and there simply is no more money. And so it is just bad economic policy in addition to being cruel.
I do have one final sort of question. These are kind of coming to me right now, but I know you said you were an advocacy group and this is sort of a strategy sort of workshop. And you mentioned that there's a lot of support. You put, ALEC up, which is always interesting to see them as a partner. And you see all these other organizations on the left and the right that are sort of supporting this fines and fees reform. I'm wondering what kind of but there's a lot of states, you said, I don't know, I think in the 40s or 30s that have fines and fees, high fines and fees and driver suspensions and other penalties. What kind of messaging do you find most effective at reaching these sorts of states? Is it usually the economic? I know you showed too the Florida and the New York one, but I'm curious what you find is most effective, and then which states do you see posing the most trouble at changing or having reform in?
Sure. I'll start, and then Wesley, if you want to jump in and add to this and what you're seeing locally on what you think works where you are. So, I mean, sort of in the first part, I sort of said we're down to 36 states that still suspend licenses for unpaid fines and fees. It's an area that in just 3 years we've moved mountains. There's now 14 states that have stopped suspending driver's licenses, and they are very diverse states that can be everywhere. But every single state has a fine and fee problem. Every single locality has a fine and fee problem, and the way it looks manifests itself very differently. I will say that depending on who your audience is, there's different messaging that I think can be really effective. But when you're talking to legislators, overall, they want to understand. I think you still have to center, sort of who's being harmed and how, but you really have to sort of talk about the economic impacts to the entire community. And that can be incredibly persuasive. there was a study that was done in Phoenix, Arizona, of a license reinstatement program where they helped 7,000 people reinstate their licenses. And the University of Arizona some researchers there did a study to actually project what were the impacts of restoring people's licenses. And what they found is with those just 7,000 licenses getting restored, they projected that would help the Phoenix economy grow by $149 million because of how many people were losing jobs when their licenses were suspended, and how many people got their jobs back or had their incomes go up when they were suspended and were able to spend money again and participate in the economy. So it's the labor wages alone were something like $87 million, but those grow and reverberate. I mean, the best investment you can get is someone who is low income, because they will spend all of the money that they get because they are living with no excess to put in savings. If you give a rich person $100, that will likely go into savings and not reverberate into the economy. If you give a poor person who already cannot support their basic needs, that money is going to go right back into the economy. And so when we think about stimulating the economy, doing things that help low income communities are the best ways to stimulate the economy. And really focusing, I think, on that message can be effective and helpful.
And I actually don't have a great answer to that question. I think we're still trying to figure out the best ways to message. We have been effective with messaging locally, but I think the local conversation is very different from the statewide conversation. Tennessee has a Republican supermajority in our state legislature, so there's not a lot of traction all the time, particularly when it comes to criminal justice issue areas. But I do think that, as Joanna has mentioned multiple times at this point, there are many conservative kind of voices that are open to limiting or shrinking criminal justice system, and I think this is one way. This at least it could be framed as a way to do that.
Yeah, and I think that framing this as a hidden tax is a way that speaks to some Republican partners who really don't like taxes. Now, part of the reason we're in this mess is because of not funding things through taxes and defunding government generally. The no new taxes movement going together with the 2008 recession is sort of why we're in this mess. But we will partner with people and take our allies as they come. And it's been really helpful to sort of hear from the Republicans who partner with us that they do not want the hidden taxes, but also that there's really broad agreement that we should not make it impossible for people to work and support their family. And I think that is a message that works in any political environment, that if you are having consequences that make it impossible for people to support themselves and support their families, then it's bad for everyone. I will say in bluer states, we talk more about fairness and equity. But we try to make sure that we talk about the racial justice, criminal justice, and economic justice piece everywhere. But the emphasis and sort of the first line may look a little bit different depending on if we are talking about this in Florida or we are talking about this in New York.
I have a question. I know we're past 3 o'clock, but from a social insurance perspective, like what is the relationship you see, and how would you want to partner going forward with some of the people that were at the conference the past 3 days?
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, we think that this is a driver of people needing social insurance, that we are forcing people out of the mainstream economy and leaving them no way of supporting themselves but for using social insurance. And this is one of the stresses on social insurance, when we actually make it impossible for people to work and support their families. So I think that we see this also in the evictions context, that this is a driver of evictions. This is a driver of people needing public benefits. All of these are very intersectional. And so when we then when fines and fees make it impossible for people to leave the criminal legal system and to support themselves and their families, and then we have a social insurance network practice in the state that is not strong enough to actually provide a meaningful safety net. It's these things combined that take someone and then on the basis of their poverty, sort of take away every piece of their ability to function and to assure their own freedom.
Yeah, I would just piggyback off of what Joanna said, and I also think the ways that fines and fees also kind of lead people back into the system also creates oftentimes or sometimes an ineligibility for certain types of social insurance programs. So that's another way that fines and fees, I think, relates to this.
Great.
We'll follow you guys on social media. Sorry, Jay.
No worries.
And try to get involved that way. Is that where you put like campaigns and things?
Yes, please do. And sign up for our newsletter. We send out a monthly newsletter that talks about what's happening with fines and fees reform around the country so that you can keep up. That would be wonderful. And please do follow us on, we're probably most active on Twitter, but we're on Facebook as well.
Awesome. Well, if there's no other, oh, Wesley, go ahead.
I don't have a public social media myself, but my job, Just City, if you want to look that up, does have a social media where they post a lot of stuff around our work.
Great, thanks so much. And please contact, you can contact the National Academy of Social Insurance if you'd like to get in touch with Wesley or Joanna after this conference is over. We're always happy to put our partners in touch with other attendees. At this time, I guess, thank you so much, Joanna, Wesley, for hosting this workshop. Thank you everyone for attending and attending this conference in general. And please, we will send a follow-up email with questions about this workshop and the conference, and we really do value feedback so that we can always fine-tune our conferences to more what our attendees want and what you felt that needs to improve or what you liked. So we really do rely on those on that feedback. So really asking if you can spare a few minutes just to answer a short survey after this conference, that'd be great. But otherwise, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Super, really great.
Thank you. Enjoyed it very much. Thank you all.